Our next presenter, it's my great pleasure to introduce Micheal Syme. He will present this morning's presentation on high-tech tools and their use in the bee apiary. Micheal is the Vice President of the North Shore Beekeepers Association, as well as a member of the ABA. The first part of Micheal's presentation looks at the use of infrared cameras and what additional management information that can give to the recreational beekeeper. He'll then move to a second part, without my interruption, lucky Micheal. He'll present the second part on time focusing on the use of weight scales in beekeeping and what additional information you can obtain to assist your management of the hives. Mr. Symes, sorry. So, please welcome Micheal Syme.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I actually wanted to get a show of hands, so I was wondering if we could increase the lights just a tad so I can see who's actually in the audience. How many of you have a flow hive? Can I just have a show of hands? Okay, so probably about a third, maybe a quarter. How many of you have more than 5 hives? Okay, so we've got, quite a few. And how many of you have your hives located not at your actual residential address? So we've got quite a few of those as well. That's good, because this talk is aimed specifically at you. Okay, now I've got an idea of who I'm talking to. Let me tell you a bit more about myself. I currently have 22 hives. I also manage 5 hives. Some of those are flow hives. And my challenge has always been time, because I'm a part-time recreational beekeeper. So my challenge was to know what was happening inside the hive during winter. So there was always a couple of options. And the first option was to open the hive, but the problem was quite often the winter is too cold. And I should state right up front here, all of this research has been done on the northern beaches, but there are similar information for up in the Blue Mountains, for instance, and there's a lot of information from the US as well from this stuff. But if the weather's too cold, how can you tell how your bees are progressing? Now, the books tell me that I should go around and lift up the back of the hive to feel the weight of the hive. But I've got to be honest, that tells me absolutely nothing. And I can't remember what they weighed the last time I did it anyway. So the alternative is to use an infrared camera. And the big advantage of the infrared camera, or thermal imaging camera to give it the correct title, is it's like being like Superman. You can see through walls. So there's 2 cameras that I use. The first one is a standalone camera, and that's a picture of it in the bottom of the slide there. And the second one is an attachment, and that's the picture that is on the far side, and that attaches to your iPhone. So if you've got an iPhone, it just clips onto the bottom of the iPhone, and you just put it away when you're not using it. When you want to use it, you can just clip it on there. And it enables you, as I said, to be like Superman and look through walls. Both of these cameras cost around about $600. Or the alternative is you can hire one, or you can be like me and have your best friend who lives across the road who happens to own his own plumbing business, and he has one that he uses for the business. So I just go and borrow it. So what can we see with the infrared camera? So the first shot there, and it's hive number M, which is M for Mike, and you can see the first shot is just using a normal camera, and the second shot shows you the infrared camera. And you can see where I've got the arrow pointing, where you can see the cluster of the brood. So this is in the middle of winter, this is about July, and that's where those bees are. They're clustering and they're in the bottom brood box there. It's a double brood box system. Now, over on the far corner, you can see a red patch just near the 8.5, and that is where I was standing, and that's showing up as a hot spot. That's how sensitive these cameras are. So that's how you get all those strange and wonderful colours. You ignore a lot of those, but you're looking at the cluster, and the red is showing the cluster. So if we look at another hive, and this is a bigger, stronger hive. So this is 2.5 brood boxes. And one of the things that I don't do is I don't pack my hives down for winter. And I'll get to the reason for that later on. But this is 2.5 brood boxes. So 2 full depths and an ideal. And you can see from the infrared image that that is absolutely packed full of bees. And this is in July. And if I was going to almond pollination, that's the hive I'd take to almond pollination. So it's a much bigger cluster, and interestingly, it's not in the centre. It's offset. It's on the western side of the box. Now, you could have found out this information if you opened the hive in the middle of winter as well, but we didn't. We didn't disturb the bees. We didn't break the propolis seal. The bees are quite oblivious to us being there. This hive is a 2 brood box hive with a queen excluder, and it's got a smaller cluster, but this time it's on the northern side. And this is hive number A, which is alpha. This hive, 1 brood and the queen excluder, and it has 2 ideals there for insulation of honey, right, in inverted commas. And I'm sure that you've all heard people tell you that you should leave lots of honey there for insulation. And I think I can hear Len shuffling in the back. But if you have a look, the honey is not actually adding as insulation. Right? It's not keeping the hive warm. The hive is being kept warm by the bees in the cluster. But the interesting impact here is what's happening with the queen excluder. It's a metal queen excluder, and of course, as soon as I tell you it's metal, you think, oh, well, that will transmit heat, and exactly what happens here. Same hive, different angle, and here you can see very much the red being the hottest part of the scale. You can see the heat being transmitted through the queen excluder. Now, when you live in Terry Hills and we're very close to the coast there, we don't get frost, it probably doesn't matter. But if you're up in the Blue Mountains and you're trying to keep your hive as warm as possible, that metal queen excluder could be draining quite a lot of heat, being energy. Bees that produce that heat and they want to keep it in the hive, that could be draining it to the outside environment. So it's just something to think about. Finally, a strong 2 brood box hive. As I said, I run most of my hives as 2 brood boxes. And again, you can see white being the hottest colour here is being projected by the brood, the queen excluder. Interestingly, the brood is above and below the queen excluder. So the queen excluder is actually in the middle, or not quite the middle, but it's in the cluster. Interestingly, you can observe the bees through winter moving up when you have a 2 brood box system. If the cluster starts in the bottom box, they will gradually move up. But that's a different presentation about why you have 2 brood boxes. So what did I learn with my camera? Well, the first thing that I learned is that queen excluders radiate heat in winter. I didn't know that. I hadn't read that in any articles. I hadn't read that in any books. It's not a major issue where I am, but it could be a major issue. I can see the size and the position of the cluster. So I know roughly where they are and how they're tracking during winter. If the bees have died out, I can see that as well. If they're dead, I can see that. There will be no sign of a cluster at all, taken from any of the 4 angles. third thing I learned is that bees don't heat the hive. It's not like a house where you turn on the heater and you heat the whole room. The bees are only interested in heating the cluster, and they're only interested in heating the cluster if they've got eggs. So think about those penguins up in the Antarctic where they all cluster together. Out in the Antarctic, it's minus 50 or 60 degrees outside, and they're keeping warm. They're not trying to heat the Antarctic. Well, if they are, that explains global warming. But no, they're not trying to heat the Antarctic, they're just trying to heat themselves. The same thing applies with the bees. The fourth thing I learned is that honey isn't an insulator for the hives. The bees that had, or the hives that had more honey on them, weren't staying warmer than the ones that had less honey. So honey's not an insulator. Yes, it absorbs heat. Yes, it'll put out heat. But the bees don't try and warm the honey. They try and warm the brood. The final thing is, as I said, the FLIR camera, and FLIR is the technical name for an infrared camera, or sorry, it's a brand of infrared cameras, they're the market leader, will tell me if the hive is dead. And you'll see that the DPI uses infrared cameras at things like almond pollination to check hives very quickly. They can just go along, take a photo of a hive, assuming that the sun hasn't come out, and they can tell straight away whether there's a dead out in that hive. And the final thing there is that technology is fun. This is technology that was developed by the armed services, I suppose you'd call it. The army used infrared cameras, as does the police, for searching for people. I'm just adapting it and going, hey, this is fun, let's look at the beehives. So we've got other uses for the camera as well, because once you've photographed your beehives once or twice, you go, well, what am I going to do with my camera? So one of the things that I've been using it for is identifying where bees are in a tree. And you think, oh, I can see where the bees are going in and out of that tree. I can work out the cluster must be there. Sometimes it's not. So here's a photo of a tree. And you can see from the heat signature that the bees have got a long extended hive inside that tree. So if you'd just gone along and cut out a little section thinking that's where the bees are, you would have ended up cutting through this particular hive. You can use your camera indoors. So when you get a phone call from somebody who says, oh, I've got bees in my house, can you come and help me find them or remove them? Here's a photo, and the first one is of their, I think that was their sitting room or dining room, the corner. And the second one is the infrared image. Now this camera is the one that attaches to the iPhone. I didn't take these photos. And with that camera you can adjust, like the previous speaker was talking about, you can adjust it back. So you can get rid of a lot of the colour and just look at the hottest section. And that hot section there is right in the corner. And the third one shows what happens when you open the ceiling. There's the beehive there, which he then subsequently removed. And you think, oh, that's okay, that's through plasterboard. You don't have to be much of a Superman to see that. I could probably feel that with my hand. Well, here's a challenge. Here's a picture of a concrete wall. This is on a commercial building. That's the heat signature. And if you look closely at the photo where he's drilling it, you can see he's drawn that size with a pencil on the concrete so that he knows where the actual hive is. So rather than just drilling random holes, he's going to drill straight through there. And guess what? He drilled straight into the hive. Spot on. And look at the thickness of that concrete. Now, the image wasn't real distinct when he was looking at it, but it was distinct enough for him to be game enough to go and drill holes into that wall. He got paid quite a lot of money to remove that particular hive. So that's what I use my infrared camera for. I have a lot of fun with my infrared camera. And I have quite a lot of debates with people about whether honey is a insulator, and I think I win most of those debates, but never mind. The next question I had was, how can I tell if there is a nectar flow? And all the people in my bee club told me, oh, that's easy, Michael. You just look out the window, and if the trees are flowering and the bees are working the trees, there's got to be a nectar flow on. But that's not actually true. My next question is, well, there might be a little bit of a nectar flow, but how can I tell how strong that nectar flow is? Are the bees just consuming that nectar, or are they storing it? So at my place, I have 300 lavender plants, and they flower right through, 7 or 8 months of the year. But is that honey being collected and stored, or is that honey just being consumed? Am I just keeping the bees alive with those lavender plants? These were questions that I wanted to answer. The third question was, I want to stop going into my hive every 2 weeks or 3 weeks to determine whether they got a queen or not. I want to know whether I can tell that just by observing or some other way. Can I work out whether the hive is queenless or not? Final thing is, does my hive have plenty of reserve? Without me going in there, do I need to worry about that? This becomes really important when you've got your bees at a location other than your house, because they might be an hour's drive up the road, and you want to save time and not have to go up there, or go up there and see whether you need to do anything. You want to know what's been happening for the last month. What's actually happening inside the hive? We can observe when we open the hive, but if your observation takes 30 minutes, you open the hive, you keep it open for 30 minutes, you close it, and even if you did that the next day, you're still only seeing it 1/48th of what's actually happening every day. And if you only open it once every 3 weeks, it gets down to decimal dust. So what other ways can I see what's happening in my hive? And the final thing is, does my hive have AFB? Well, I'll tell you, this system doesn't tell you that. There is no substitute for opening your hive and inspecting the brood. So you still have to do that, and you have to do that at least every 3 months. But we can tell you a lot of information to supplement your visual observations. So this is where I started weighing my hives. I started to use the first weight scales in April 2018. They're located on my hive, which is called Echo, and all my hives have got alpha numeric names, so Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. I download the data from the weight scales onto my mobile phone using Bluetooth. Now, the system that I use, which is called Broodminder, does have a facility where you can upload it to the satellite and then access it remotely, or up to the cloud and get it accessed remotely. I don't use that because I travel to the apiaries, but if you had one that you weren't able to travel to, or you wanted to remotely look at it, you could use that as well. That is a lot more expensive. Now, there's lots of different weight scales around, and I'm not here saying this is the best. All I'm saying is I've used this one, and this is what it's telling you, or telling me. And I know that New Zealand makes, or somebody in New Zealand makes one as well. I looked at that, but that was a lot more expensive than these ones, which come from America. Now, my location, all my hives are on the northern beaches. So just remember that when you're looking at the flows. So I've been measuring the weight of this particular hive over 12 months, and I'm going to show you the data over 12 months. It's a strong hive. You saw it earlier. It's got 2 brood boxes and it's got a queen excluder. It was not packed down for winter, and I did that deliberately. I just wanted to see what happens. And this is the reason why I've stopped packing down my hives for winter, because I realised that we actually get a really strong nectar flow in autumn. And if I pack down my hives, then the bees don't get the opportunity to store that. I extracted 30 kilos from this particular hive in November and again in March. So this hive gave me 60 kilos, and at the end it weighed more than when I started. I placed the stickies back in the hives, and you will see there will be some funny figures where it drops down and then it increases a little bit. That's because I took the frames out and then I put the stickies back. And there was no spring treatment other than looking for AFB. So I went right through the hive looking for AFB. I did no spring expansion. I didn't pull any frames up from the bottom brood box to the top brood box. I didn't expand the brood box. Basically, I wanted this hive to swarm. And I wanted to see what the impact was of swarming on the weight of the hive. And I've got to say, I was very successful. If anybody wants to know how to make your bees swarm, come and talk to me later. Right. It swarmed in spring. Well, you know, I didn't have to be Einstein to realise that. It was a strong hive to start with. Okay, so this is the first chart, and this is the weight gain from the 23rd of April to the 1st of June. 1st of June's the start of winter. And it put on 30 kilos. Now, I'll just explain, and I haven't got my pointer, but that's okay. The scale on the side there, you'll see the numbers. It's got an X2 on the top. So that's the raw data, and the way that the broodminder works, you weigh the back or the front of the hive, and then you multiply it by 2, because you're only weighing half the hive. And you can adjust that. There's a system within it, so that you can adjust that minutely if you want to. If it's 52, 48% because of the way that you've done it, that's adjustable. I just use the raw data here. So there is a 30 kilo weight gain in autumn. Normally we tell people, to start packing your hive down in, about Easter. You're going to miss this if you pack it down. So 30th of May was the peak of the weight. It started to go down a little bit since then. So what happened on the 30th of May? And this is the beauty about this data. There is so much information here, you can pull it and you can drill down. So right at the start it was midnight and it was at 71.5. Remember, you've got to multiply that by 2, but I'm just going to give you the raw figures. It's increased slightly from midnight through to 7 o'clock in the morning, which was basically sunrise. And that had me puzzled, and I'll explain why it did it a bit later on. Then went down to 70.8 with the bees leaving. They're all going off to do their thing. Increased, then went down again. And then it increased right through the day up until 5 p.m. And then started to slowly decrease after 5 p.m. Now, that decrease after 5 p.m. is easily explained. They brought in raw nectar and they started to process it. And so as they're processing it, they're getting rid of some weight. They're getting rid of some water. So I'm looking at this raw data, and the problem is I'm looking at the data in isolation. And what I'm saying here is don't look at it in isolation. Look at it with your eyes as well. Observe what's happening in that hive, but also look at it in relation to the weather. So what was the weather on the 30th of May? 13.1 degrees minimum, up to 17.3, lovely sort of autumn day. Except it was scattered showers, and it scattered showers in the morning, 3.4 millimetres, which isn't a lot for Terry Hills, but it was enough to increase the weight of the hive during the night. And that would have been just the moisture sitting on the hive or even being absorbed into some of the timber. It cleared in the afternoon, And remember I showed you there was a double peak in the morning? That was possibly that the bees went out and it was wet and they came back and then they went out again when it cleared up a bit more. Humidity was 88%, 10 wind. The hive added 1.4 kilos on that one particular day, which is not bad. I'd like it to do that every day. And something was flowering. And of course, I didn't think to look, did I? I have my suspicions, but I can't confirm that. So again, you need to use your eyes as well as the scales, as well as the physical observations, right, to be able to complete the picture. But if you didn't have the weight scales, you would not have thought that was a particularly spectacular day as far as the bees went. So what happened after May? Well, the hive maintained its weight right through June and July. And you can see, and the ups and downs here are just interday variations. And you can get that eliminated if you really work on balancing the scales from side to side. I don't bother. Okay, so we got to the end of July, and unfortunately all the scales down the bottom are in American code, so not Australian code, and the program won't allow me to change it. It started to lose weight in August. And this was when I was concerned, because normally in August the 16th is when I normally go into my hives to start my spring expansion. So 24th of July through to the 8th of August it was actually a nectar flow. Something was flowering. And then from the 12th of August right through to the 25th of August, which is when I want to go in there to expand the brood area, it's losing weight. You can see I inspected it on the 16th of August, which just happens to be my birthday, so I know that's the day I go and inspect my hives. I spoke to a commercial beekeeper about this, and I said, why would I be losing so much weight in August? And he said something uncomplimentary to me and said, the bees are converting the honey into brood. So what you're seeing there is the start of the spring build-up. So this now tells me that the start of the spring build-up in this particular case probably started on about the 10th of August and increased right through August. So it tells me I am right to go in there on the 16th or a date close to that to start my spring expansion. Okay, so what happened after that? Well, once they dropped their weight, they then started to increase. And you can see that we had 2 nectar flows there. And what's happening there is this is that spring nectar flow. This is swarming season. This is what happens. We know this is what happens. The bees build up, and I can see there that they're putting on weight. The first flowering was the stronger one. I want to make sure that I capture that in future and make sure that there's plenty of room for them to store that nectar. Now, as I said, I did no spring prevention at all. I wanted this hive to swarm because I thought, oh, this will be great. I'll see a great big drop here and I'll be able to predict in future when they're going to swarm. I've circled when they actually did swarm, which was the 9th of the 10th. And that was actually October, it's the October long weekend. And the weight, you can see, dropped dramatically. Now, it dropped both pre and after the swarming. But I've got to be honest, if I was looking at somebody's chart, there's no way that I could pinpoint that particular event just by looking at the graph. There's too much noise on that graph to be able to definitively say, yes, that's the date that they swarmed. You can see here that I finally gave up because it was so full of honey. I extracted honey on the 9th of November. So it swarmed. I knew it was going to swarm. I saw the swarm. That's the swarm. If you ever wondered what a swarm looks like in infrared, that's what it looks like in infrared. So this was quite a warm day. The ambient temperature here was 26.7 degrees, but the swarm itself was up in the 40s, the actual temperature of the swarm. So they're very active and producing a lot of heat. Now we know that. Anybody who catches swarms knows that swarms produce a lot of heat. That's part of the problem when you get a really big swarm and you put it in a small box, it produces a lot of heat. So this just confirmed with what I already knew. So what did we learn? Up until that point, we learned that the nectar flow, the strong nectar flow, lasted for 10 days. I had no idea how long my nectar flows were. I could see the trees flowering, but they flowered for longer than 10 days, but obviously they weren't putting out the nectar. It was followed by a weaker nectar flow, which lasted for nearly 12 days. So not all nectar flows are equal. Just because you see the flowers doesn't mean that there's nectar there. They swarmed 4 days later, after the nectar flows had actually finished. I wonder whether that had some influence on them swarming. And so swarm preparation started 14 days earlier than that, which was the 25th of September. Now that's what the books tell me, that once they've decided they're going to swarm, they will swarm, whether it's 14 days, 10 days, 12 days later. And maybe it was because there was lack of room. But I'm running 2 brood boxes. I wasn't manipulating them, but I suspect that it's because they were storing nectar in those brood boxes. So what happened after September right through to Christmas? Well, there was the chart I showed you earlier where we had the swarming event, then we dropped the weight. You can see what I was saying before. Dropped the weight right down when I took all the frames out, put the weight up a bit when I put the stickies back. Nice when the graph reinforces what I physically did. And then so from after the harvest, you can see that there was another nectar flow. And that was a reasonable nectar flow. But remember, I've just lost 60% of my bees because they've swarmed. So if I'd kept those bees, I could have taken advantage of that nectar flow. In the 4 weeks, it increased from 110 to 140 kilos. So 30 kilos was added there. Imagine how much I could have put in if I'd had twice as many bees. So end of the year, we're into January, and I'm going to flick through these fairly quickly, mainly because they're boring. And boring's good, because there's nothing really going on there. So if you're going to take a holiday, you could take a holiday in January or in February. February's pretty boring. They're just getting on. They're not putting on weight, they're losing a little bit of weight. They're working the lavender pretty hard, but obviously it's just maintaining them. March, they were going okay, and then I think they had a bit of a drop. Well, they had a bit of a drop, but that could have been weather related. That could have been the fact that they were stuck in there for a week or so with the rain. April was pretty boring, so again, if you want to go for a holiday, go for a cruise. April's a good time to go if you live in Terry Hills. But May's when it gets exciting. And remember, most of us at this stage are thinking about winter. We're going to pack our bees down, and the bees are going, nope, we need to build up. So they're built up from 50, added 40 kilos. So what have I learnt from all of this? First of all, I can now tell you when a nectar flow is on. Now, there's other ways that you can tell when you've had a nectar flow. White wax, beautiful frames that you can enter into the Royal Easter Show. That'll tell you that you've just had a nectar flow. But I can tell you when it's actually on, not after the event. I know that I failed to maximise that 4-week flow in November, December because they had swarm. So if I can stop them swarming, then I can get more honey with very little effort, just the effort to stop them swarming. So note to self, don't let them swarm. This year I've managed to stop them all from swarming, but again, that's a different talk. There's a big flow on in May, autumn, and they produce beautiful show frames. But it also means that I can extract in February, knowing full well that the bees are going to, I can basically take everything, if it's capped, it's mine. Principle, knowing full well that the bees are going to be getting a nectar flow before winter. The other thing that I learnt is after Christmas is not a great time for breeding queens. Well, I thought that that was strange that my queens kept failing when I was breeding them after winter, but now I have an explanation that maybe there wasn't the nectar flow on that I thought there was. So now I've expanded, 3 apiaries now have all got weight bars. And I've put duplicates in some of the apiaries. Now you might say, well, why would you put a duplicate there? You know, you've already got a weight bar, you've got 5 or 6 hives in that apiary, why bother putting a duplicate on there? And my question was, is this hive that we've just looked at the details of, is that typical of the other hives that are in that apiary? Now, given that they're all fairly balanced, that's fine, but maybe that one's just stronger than any of the others and the rest of them aren't doing anything like that. So I put 2 weight bars on 2 hives side by side. Well, no, there's 1 hive in between. And I looked at what the flow was for May, because by this time I purchased another weight bar. Now, they're not identical, but they do show the same trend. And it's the trend that I'm interested in. So I know that I only need to have the weight bar on 1 hive in a small apiary. If I had 25 hives, I might want to have 2 or 3 weight bars in that 25. They're very easy to download. You just walk up to them with your Bluetooth on your phone. It tells you when it connects to the weight bar, put your phone down and go and start doing something else, come back, it's downloaded it. So being an American invention, the companies in America, they're very good with their customer service, but they've also got a lot of data on their website. So I looked at some American data on swarming, and they're saying, and you can see where the arrow is, that they reckon they can pick the swarming. My experience was I couldn't as an event, but they're saying you can. Now, what they also do on their hives there, which I don't do in Australia, is they also have temperature sensors. And the temperature sensors are available, but when I first started off, I just purchased the weight bars. I have purchased temperature sensors now. So the other thing that they looked at was, can you pick the swarming event from the temperature? Now, the temperature in the brood area is maintained at a very constant speed, very constant temperature, not speed. So here's their charts. Now they're showing the winter broodless on this side of the chart. That's what those big dips are. So when the bees don't have any brood at all, right, they don't maintain the cluster at the same temperature. But once they start with their brood, right, you can see that that graph is very straight. And they're showing that they can pick a peak in the temperature for when they swarm. I'm going to try it, see if I can pick it. So what are the applications for all beekeepers? Well, first of all, you can reduce the number of times that you open your hive. And one of the things that I find when I teach beginners is the beginners always want to open their hive every week or every second week. And tend to overuse the smoke anyway, and disrupt the hive and set it back. And every time you smoke them, you set them back a day or two. So if you can fill in those missing gaps and say only open your hive every month, but go and weigh it every week or second week, then you can start to fill in those gaps. The bees will appreciate it, and you've got less chance of killing your queen. The other thing is it allows you to track what's happening, the flora resources, so that you can then go, okay, now I know when the bloodwoods are flowering or when the stringy bark's flowering, that's when I'm likely to get a good nectar flow. And then you can track that back, because that doesn't happen on the same day every year. You can track that back to when the rain happened. And if the rain was 6 weeks prior to the eucalyptus flowering, right, you've got a better chance of getting a really strong nectar flow. Or at least that's my experience. But it also allows you to match your observations, just sitting there watching your bees. How many of you go and sit there and watch your bees? Like, come on, put your hand up. Yeah, we all do it. Now you can match that observation with what the weight of the hive is and the temperature of the hive. So I don't get obsessed with the actual weight of the hive. I don't really care, because I've got scales on different hives. Some hives are 50 kilos, some hives are 20 kilos, doesn't really matter. I'm looking for the trend, and it's the trend that you're after. And it gives you that trend data, and you can download that, send it to your computer, email it to yourself, open it up in Excel, and you can spend hours playing with that data if you want to. And the final thing is, it's real fun. Seriously, this is the most fun you're going to have without a smoker in your hand. So, tracking temperature. Now, the temperature probe fits between the two boxes. So you just slip it in there between the two boxes where they normally build the burr comb. Just whack in your temperature probe. Has a nice strip. Doug Purdy at the Urban Beekeepers got them, and you can go down and see him and talk to him about them. They're very easy to use. The only thing is, with the temperature probes, they do put propolis on it. Right, so just be aware of that, and don't be shocked when it happens. They still work. They just decide it's a foreign object, they'll propolise it. So here's a really interesting experiment. So you've got your temperature probe, you go in and you remove the queen. You take her out. What happens? Well, you can see that straight away they reacted to you removing your queen, and they had a peak. And then that peak is actually only a couple of degrees. It's not a huge peak. And then you can see as the brood started to hatch, and this was all capped brood at this stage, all finally hatching, the temperature started to go less and less controlled. The bees gave up controlling the temperature of the cluster. Maybe they were getting disillusioned with the fact that they were queenless. Obviously, this hive didn't build queen cells. Okay, the conclusion. First thing is, temperature probes can identify when you're broodless. If that's one of your major concerns, if you're really concerned about losing your queen, temperature probe's going to give you that peace of mind. You can just have your one hive, have a temperature probe on it, and you don't have to open it to know that it's got brood. So that's a pretty big load off your mind, particularly given that beginners tend to kill queens. And I don't mean they do it deliberately, but that's a common problem. The scales can confirm a nectar flow. So these scales are used in all sorts of different applications. I worked with people who were releasing the honey eaters into the Kapiti Valley, where they thought they knew when the nectar flow was because they were looking at all the trees. And when they did the same thing down in Victoria and Gippsland, they released their birds. All the trees were flowering, but there was no nectar, and half the birds died in the first week. These were captive bred. So they recaptured them, kept them for another 2 weeks, and then re-released them, and they all survived because they picked the flowering, not the nectar flow as being the event. So you can do your visual checks, and please do your visual checks. Don't read this as less opening and managing your hive. Read this as additional information. And, white wax tells you when there's lots of nectar coming in, as does Beekeeping in your lid and all the other signs. But the fact that the trees are flowering doesn't mean that there's nectar there. One weight scale, in my experience, is representative of your site. But then you might have another site that might be 2 kilometres away or a kilometre away, and they will have totally different environment, particularly in the suburban environment. I'm not talking about out in the country, I'm talking about suburban beekeeping. It's a very non-invasive technique, and so therefore the bees don't suffer. And it gives you a better understanding so that you can really appreciate what your bees are doing for you. Okay, the other major learning for me was there was more honey in the hive in August than there was in April. So all the books that I read that say, pack your bees, your hive down, make sure they've got lots of honey, you don't want them to starve, doesn't apply in Terry Hills. In Terry Hills, they're going to have more honey at the end than they started with because they get the chance, due to our weather, our flora, to go out there and collect nectar. And maybe that applies to you as well. If you're in suburbia, there's a lot of trees flowering, a lot of plants flowering. I know Doug, who's in the inner city, he says that he gets honey all year round. So there was about 16 kilos less than its peak in May. So May was definitely the peak for the year. It shows that I missed the major nectar flow in November because I let them swarm. So I'm not going to let them swarm in future. And the best time to breed queens, if I wanted to become a queen breeder in Terry Hills, is before Christmas. And ideally it'd be in October, November, December, because that's when I've got a natural nectar flow going. I don't have to artificially feed the queens or the bees to raise queens. I can use what's available. It also tells me there's no nectar flow in late late summer. So I don't need to constantly open my hives to see if they've got room, because if they're not adding any weight, they're not adding any honey. They may in fact decrease some weight because they're converting nectar into honey. So I can go and have my holidays in summer, go down to the beach, might even go surfing. Might even get a friend of mine to teach me how to go surfing. And there's no need, again, on the northern beaches to reduce your hive for winter. Because if you do, you're going to miss out on that May flow because you're not going to give them enough room. And remember, small hive beetle's a problem, but the honey's not an insulator. So, having some extra room there for them to store some honey or some nectar is a good thing. Okay, so I hear you all saying this is fantastic. Where do I get one of these? It just so happens, and I am not a paid employee of Doug Purdy's. I am his friend, but I like to think I'm his friend. He's here at the trade show down the bottom. He's the Australian agent for Broodminder. He can answer your questions. He can give you technical advice. If you need other technical advice, I can recommend the website and the people at the end of the queries. The only disadvantage you have dealing with an American is that they are operating on the opposite timescale to you. So the best thing to do is to send them an email in the evening, and they'll then respond when you get up in the morning, or will have responded. But they're very helpful, great customer service. So that's basically, price-wise, the weight scales are under $300, and the temperature probes, I think, are about $60 or $70. And the app, you can just download the app from the Apple Store, it's free. Okay, questions, but I can't see anybody, so might need some lights or people to stand up. Okay, so the question is, when did I take those photos of the cluster in the winter? And I deliberately picked the cold days because if I do it when the sun's on my apiary, the sun warms up the boxes. I can still see it on the camera, but it's because I know what I'm looking for. So yeah, first thing in the morning, but I didn't get up at Sparrows. I got up there at about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock and took the photos then, but on a cold morning. Yeah. Okay, so it wasn't so much a question as information that there are apps that allow you to remotely control your camera. By putting a spare camera on site, you can then remotely access it, and basically they're developed for security purposes. But you don't need to go to that much trouble. If you go and talk to Doug, he sells a complete unit that is for remote access. And all it needs to have, I think it's 3G a mobile carrier, and it has a solar panel, it has batteries, has the whole works, and it automatically, you dial it up to the cloud and it does the whole job for you. And it comes in a box already with instructions, so it's fairly easy to use. Yes? Okay, so the question is, what's my way of stopping to swarm? Unfortunately, you're going to have to ask the organisers to bring me back for that talk. It's more than one answer. Okay, but yes, I can talk about that. That's quite okay. Okay, so I started collecting the data in April 2018, and I'm still collecting the data. I was collecting it yesterday. So just over a year, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, in Germany they listen to the hive for when it's going to swarm, and no, you could put a microphone there, but no, I haven't used one. And yes, I know that the hive does make a noise before it swarms, but in my book that's too late. You need to be doing stuff 2 weeks prior to that, because when they're going to swarm, they're going to swarm. There's nothing you can do to stop them, other than catch them when they land. Yeah. Yes? Sorry? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Good. Okay. Thank you. That's it.